Hello there. In this lesson we're going to show you how you can create your own personalized pendant. Again, we're going to show you how to use the Enneper curves that are pre-created objects for you in Fluid Designer for 3D printing. But this time we're going to show you how you can create three-dimensional objects. So rather than the kind of flat pendant that you've probably done so far in watching the videos, we're going to show you how you can create a three-dimensional object. So if you start Fluid Designer up and if you go to the Pendants folder, if I just scroll down, I'm looking for Enneper curves. So if you watched the last video, you would have used this object here, an Enneper curve pendant 001. Now, as you scroll through these objects, you should notice that some objects, they look similar in terms of the icon, the picture that's displayed there, but if you look carefully at the numbers are slightly different. This says 301, this says 001. If you see a 3, that means that the object is essentially a three-dimensional object, so this next object and the next object. So certain patterns are available both as a kind of flat 2D kind of object and also as a three-dimensional object. So just look out for the 3 at the beginning of the number. Now if you drag and drop that object onto the workspace, it is very similar to the previous video in that the size is about 14 millimeters in the X and the Y direction. But notice in this case that the Z is 7.2 millimeters. If you go back to the previous video, the Z was set at 1 millimeter because the bevel object was 1 millimeter. Well, the bevel object is also 1 millimeter here. This is 1 millimeter thick. But if I'll just switch on screencast keys. If I hold down the center mouse button and rock the mouse, you can see what's happening here. This object has got more depth to it than just the thickness of it. So it is still just an Enneper curve, and if I delete the cross-section diameter there, you can see the Enneper curve. It's actually created again using a math function, XYZ math function, which is actually a mesh. Okay, so it's this object, this command here on the mesh menu that's been used with these 3 equations to develop this curve. And again, if I press the tab key and go into edit mode and zoom in, you can see it's made up of a number of control points. So if we just wrap the thickness back around this object, okay, you can see that it looks like that. And if we go to view and view it from the top, so very similar to the previous exercise, we've created some modifiers for you, some array modifiers, and we've called them set the columns and set the rows. So if we change the count for the rows here, for example, 3, you can see that the size of this is about just over 30 millimeters, and you can see that we can also, like in the previous videos, adjust the relative offset. But notice what we've got here. We've got a three-dimensional object. It's got some depth to it, and it looks quite different from different angles. So you can change the count. I'll set it back to 1. Also, as in the standard Enneper curve, if you go to set the columns, if we click on here, notice that we can generate a circle, and so that's actually a three-dimensional object again that would be created. And the reason that that's created is we've got this what's called an empty, this angular rotation object here. We can see it in the outliner window. This is a special object called an empty. It's a plane axis empty, and this object is used purely and simply, it's actually that object there, it's used purely and simply to help to rotate other objects. It's not useful directly for 3D printing as such, it's used indirectly to generate this circle. And as we've explained in the previous video, the circle count here is 6. It's very important you don't go to 7, 8, 9, 10. You can't see any change to the object here, but once you go above 6, and I'll go back to 5, look, you can see with 5 we've got a gap. When we get to 6, that's the completed circle now. If we increase that to 7, effectively we've put another one on top of here, and that will cause real problems if you try and 3D print the object. Netfab Basic will probably reject it. So do be very careful if you're using this circle command that you don't go on top of this object here. Now if you want to switch circle off, you can either remove the tick from the object there, in which case you get a standard array, or you can actually just delete the object from there. So either way you can switch it off, and you can switch on to a column array. You can of course add in rows as well and generate that, but again you've got to remember that this is actually a 3-dimensional object now. So the pattern you see from above is this very attractive Enneper pattern. When you look from the side, let me look at it from the front view, that's the pattern that you'll get from the side. So that's the top view of it. That's what you'll get looking at the side of the object. Okay, so let me just take the count down a little bit. I'll take it down to 3, and if you want, you can actually make further changes to this. I mean, we've seen that you can change the thickness. Okay, you can remove the thickness, or you can change it to a kind of square cross section there. Not very attractive when you look at that bit, so do try zooming in. I think the rounded one tends to look the best with this particular object, but it's a subjective choice. You might like the square cross section, and you could make it thicker, 1.5. I quite like it at 1. But you can also go into edit mode here. So if I press the tab key and go into edit mode, you can see we've got the original. This is the initial Enneper curve. These are copies of it created by the array, and if we just zoom in, if I press C on the keyboard for circle select, and if I just highlight about 4 of the control points, 4 or 5 of the control. Now I've got to be careful here. I've actually highlighted control points at the top there and some control points at the bottom. I didn't really intend to do that, so we do need to be careful. If I do C for circle select, select those 4 control points and press the escape key. I haven't got any highlighted at the bottom, I've just got this bit at the top highlighted. And if I now drag the X-axis arrow, you can see I'm modifying the shape of my object and pulling it apart. Now at the moment I've got proportional editing on, that's this big circle here. Now I can close that circle down by scrolling the center mouse button. I've still got my finger on the left mouse button so that I can modify this object, but I'm adjusting the proportional editing circle by scrolling the center mouse. So I could modify my pattern. So it's modified it on this object, but it's duplicated on the other 3 objects as well. Now because this is a 3-dimensional object, I could go in and modify it in this direction as well if I want. And again I can position my proportional editing. Now in all honesty, what I generally find when you're making changes like this, you really just do want to stick to one direction, X or Y. You can of course press, if we switch off the snap, if I press G on the keyboard, G for grab, I can actually move the object off in any kind of direction. Now I don't know how much in the Z dimension I'm moving it at the moment, but you know, you can go really wild and throw it out like that, but you'd need to have a look in the Z if you've made any changes in the Z. I can't say that that pattern looks particularly attractive, so I'll do Control Z on the keyboard to undo those changes. Okay, I think the default Enneper curve probably looks the best. Okay, so of course, never, once you've created the object you want to print, never go to File and Save. Always go to File and Export. Export it as a wavefront object to the desktop, and just rename it so it's an Enneper curve pendant, and I'll leave it as 301 just to remind myself that that's a three-dimensional object. If I just go to File and New, so there's not a lot of three-dimensional objects here, but there are some. These alphabet ones, for example, are actually three-dimension, although, yeah, as you can see. So there's two-dimensional alphabets, which if I just drag and drop that one, you can see that's not in 3D. And then there are other objects further down. Can't quite remember which one. Yeah, so Celtic knot, for example. If you look at this icon and this icon, they look quite similar, but this is Celtic knot 4-leaf 002. This is Celtic knot 4-leaf 302. So if you drag and drop that onto the workspace, you'll see that it actually bends around like that. But you can still manipulate it in the same way. So be careful with the count again. I only need a count of 3 in this case because of the way it's set up. Okay, so that's a little bit about using some of the files that come with Designer for 3D printing for creating pendants. They've been set up so that you can create circular patterns or linear patterns quickly and easily, and in this case with 3D objects. Okay, so that's it. That's the end of this particular video. Thank you.